Hello and welcome to the Number 5 Planning Podcast. I'm Daniel Henderson. You may have heard, unless you've been living under some kind of planning rock for the last few days, that we have a new NPPF out. So to assist, we have assembled a crack team of planning and environmental barristers at Number 5 to talk through the key bits and the important headlines. I'm joined today by Peter Goatley KC, Hawley and Sioned Davies, and we're going to talk through the key topics that have popped up already. We're going to look at the standard method, we're going to look at the presumption, green and or grey belt, bits about the transitional arrangements and various other topics of importance, flood risk, the economy, renewables, affordable housing and the duty to cooperate. Lots to get into, so without any further ado, I'm going to turn to Christian to talk to us about the new standard method.
So, changes to standard methodology for local housing need, paragraph 11 in particular, what's known as the tilted balance. So taking standard method first, because that quite often leads into the tilted balance, but isn't the only route. The government obviously has now published a spreadsheet which sets out the new figures, which has been awaited with some anticipation. Obviously, I'm not going to run through all of those figures, but just taking the overall headline, we see the increase from a previous figure of 305,000 and change to now the more ambitious target of 370,408 dwellings for the country. But that's also broken down by region, and we can see that every region has an increased overall housing requirement figure, with the exception of London, which has dropped. So what that means, of course, is broken down by authority. We're seeing a lot of authorities who have got very significant changes in their numbers. So there's going to be different consequences of this, depending on which district one is dealing with, and it's having immediate consequences. So, for example, I'm dealing with a number of appeals at the minute where local authorities have got their new figures, and it plainly changes their position for their cases and indeed for their local plans going forward. But I'm not going to go through those numbers any further, because should you be interested, you can, of course, download the spreadsheet available at .gov.uk. So then, turning to the presumption in favour of sustainable development, but specifically paragraph 11D2, because much of that which was in the box under the old version of the framework is repeated in the same form. Paragraph 11D is, of course, concerned where there aren't relevant development plan policies, or those which are most important for determining the application are out of date. Then one grants permission unless the applications of the policies in this framework provide a strong reason for refusing the development proposed. So no significant or any particular change there. We're all used to dealing with that. For example, heritage policies, or landscape protection policies, greenbelt, etc. But D2 is where there's been a slight tweak, which, to my mind, is going to take some time to play out. The previous version, with which we're all very familiar, no doubt having referred to it numerous times, was that permission should be granted unless any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in this framework taken as a whole. And that remains, but we've got some little additions where it now continues, having particular regard to key policies for directing development to sustainable locations, making effective use of land, securing well-designed places and providing affordable homes individually or in combination. And it's a wording there, particular regard, which obviously certainly gives the impression, doesn't it, that there's some priority here amongst the policies. The question as to what are those key policies is answered by the new footnote 9, which sets out what they are by reference to the relevant chapter and paragraph in the framework. They're a mixed bunch, so we go from design, density, transport implications, and also the sequential test for developments in town centres. Obviously, it cuts both ways, because one can imagine a scenario where those who might wish to refuse a scheme might say, I've had particular regard to the design of the proposal before me, and I don't like it. I don't consider it to be good design, and I'm giving that some extra special weight because I'm having particular regard to it, and therefore that trumps all else. And I find that actually the adverse impacts of this scheme do significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. But of course, that cuts both ways, because if one is having particular regard to the same example, a design policy, if it is a scheme of, there's all sorts of descriptors that could be used, but exceptional quality or innovative design, or has some particular features about it which are especially favourable, then of course, as a promoter of that scheme, as an applicant, you could say, well, this design is absolutely fabulous. It's like nothing else that we've seen here. It's truly groundbreaking. That is obviously a benefit of the scheme. I don't just comply with policy, but I'm advancing design as a benefit of the scheme. And in fact, the framework tells me, paragraph 11D2 now tells me that I'm supposed to have particular regard to that key policy. So that is something which is going to be first and foremost in the overall planning balance and striking the decision as to whether permission should be granted. But of course, there's no definition of what particular regard actually means, and no doubt different decision makers will approach it in different ways. It will be interesting to see how both applicants and local planning authorities grapple with that and advance those arguments, and indeed on appeal, how inspectors deal with it to see if there is consistency in the approach to what having particular regard means, or whether there is going to be different approaches, and whether, of course, there is going to be any litigation on the matter. So one could see certainly why the government has chosen to focus on those particular policies, but the consequences of that, I think, remain to be seen.
I'm going to deal with the sort of big ticket item, the headline news, green grey belt. It's got implications for decision making and for plan making. I'm going to start mainly with decision making, because the headline is that we now have a category of grey belt. And the significance of that is that if you can demonstrate that your site is grey belt, and looking at the definition, I think there'll be plenty of sites that will meet that definition. So long as you can demonstrate need, and if your residential provides enough affordable housing, you are now appropriate development in the green belt. And that's a really significant shift. To unpack it a bit, the way in which it works is effectively this. We still have the test in paragraph 153 that we've had for some time. Inappropriate development in the green belt needs very special circumstances. But the big change is the new paragraph 155, which is a new exception to inappropriate development, and that's where grey belt comes in. There are basically 5 requirements. It's got to be grey belt. It must not fundamentally undermine the purposes, brackets taken together, of greenbelt across the area of the plan. It's got to be sustainable. There must be a demonstrable unmet need for the type of development proposed. And you've got to meet one of these new phrases, the golden rules. The requirements are complicated, but the prize is enormous, so it's worth breaking those down a bit. Firstly, what is grey belt? We now have a clear definition of grey belt, which is in the glossary. It's basically in 3 parts. First, if you are on previously developed land, you are grey belt, subject to a small exception that I'll come to in a minute. But for the majority of greenbelt land to which that won't apply, the test is whether your site, quote, does not strongly contribute to greenbelt purposes A, B, or D. So that's checking unrestricted sprawl, merging neighbouring towns, and character and setting of historic towns. That's really interesting, because that is, it seems to me, quite a high bar or a low bar, depending on what side of the bar you're on. If your site does not strongly contribute to any of those purposes, it is grey belt. I think we have to assume that because of that benchmark, and because it's not cumulative, it's possible to conceive of sites that have even, for example, a moderate contribution to all 3 of those purposes, which would still be grey belt. And because purpose C, safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, is not included, that, it seems to me, may well encompass quite a significant number of sites. It's also going to, I suspect, take up quite a lot of inquiry and appeal time arguing about what does and does not constitute a strong contribution, because a lot rides on that now. But certainly there seem to be a lot of sites that could meet that definition The caveat to both of those is that even if you meet those definitions, you are not grey belt if any of the policies that Christian was talking about in footnote 7 provide a strong reason for refusal. So those familiar set of policies that we know disapply the tilted balance. So if your land is grey belt but has heritage or flooding difficulties, you are not grey belt anymore. That's the big hurdle. Second requirement is that you must not fundamentally undermine the purposes taken together of greenbelt across the area of the plan. That, I suspect, is not going to cause trouble for the majority of sites. It's going to be, one would assume, only exceedingly large sites that are going to be capable of fundamentally undermining the purposes of the greenbelt across the plan area. So for the majority of sites, that shouldn't be an enormous stumbling block. Thirdly, it's got to be in a sustainable location. That has the potential to be a can of worms because we're not told what that means. Again, it may be that it's not as scary as it sounds because we have cross-references to various paragraphs, including paragraph 110, which covers locations which are or can be made sustainable. So there seems to be the potential there for sites which are not currently but could be made with appropriate infrastructure upgrades or whatever sustainable. So that, again, doesn't necessarily seem to be an enormous stumbling block. Fourthly, there must be a demonstrable need for the type of development. And again, that sounds a little bit scarier than it is once you dig into the detail. Footnote 56 tells us that if you're a residential development and your local authority does not have a 5-year housing land supply, you satisfy that definition automatically. Same goes where HDT housing delivery test results are below 75%. We don't get any guidance outside of residential development, so that's a question of planning judgment for individual decision makers. Then, if you are not major residential development, that's it. If you've cleared those hurdles, well done you. If you are, then you've got to comply with the golden rules, which sound a bit fantasy novel, but are quite important. There are 3 of them. 2 of them are likely to be reasonably straightforward, depending on site. So there's a requirement for infrastructure improvements and for green space, effectively. The third is to do with affordable housing. This was, as many listeners will know, something that caused a bit of consternation with the draft consultation plan because of the various ways that the government proposed imposing that requirement. We have a slightly more sophisticated option than was in the original draft, but it is a bit complicated. For the time being, basically what you need to do to work out how much affordable housing you need to provide is add 15% to the local or development plan requirement that would otherwise apply up to a cap of 50%. And if there is no requirement, it is 50%. In due course, that's going to be updated because we have a section of the NPPF earlier in paragraph 67 pursuant to which we're going to get new development plan policies that are going to cover affordable housing specifically with a minimum of 15%, subject to any viability concerns. But for the time being, it's 15% above the development plan policy. That obviously may cause viability concerns. We've been told by the government that we're going to get more guidance on viability in January. That will be important, not least because the updated viability PPG tells us that site-specific viability assessments, quote, should not be undertaken or taken into account for the time being. So that's clearly something that we're going to need more guidance on, and we're going to get it in January. Watch this space, I think, because that could be significant. But if you get through all of that, what you get as your prize is significant weight in favour of the grant of permission. And that applies if you meet the golden rules generally, not just in the green belt. So taking all of those elements together, you see the size of the shift because you have to confront things like housing land supply and footnote 7 within the 5 requirements. If you jump through all those hoops, you are in a situation where you are benefiting, despite being residential development in the green belt, benefiting from the tilted balance and having significant weight on your side of the balance as a result of having satisfied the golden rules. So that's a really significant shift, and that's the relevance for decision making. Probably worth having a quick word about plan making as well, as far as Greenbelt is concerned, because this is also important. We have an important alteration to 146 of the NPPF, which is the exceptional circumstances test for the review of Greenbelt boundaries at plan making stage. What we're told now is that exceptional circumstances are any situation in which the local authority cannot meet identified need for, as far as we can work out, any development. The phrase is homes, commercial, or other development, which seems to cover just about everything. So the position now is that exceptional circumstances ain't all that exceptional. If the local authority cannot meet identified need for any development, a Greenbelt review is triggered. And then perhaps more importantly, what we're told is where that trigger is met, the local authority must review and propose alterations to meet those needs, quote, in full, unless the review provides, quote, clear evidence that so doing would fundamentally undermine the purposes taken together of the remaining greenbelt when considered across the area of the plan. So where that trigger is met, suddenly there is a requirement to meet all outstanding need in full, unless you're able to clear the high bar of showing that doing so would fundamentally undermine greenbelt across your area. Greybelt comes back in there too, because we then have something of a sequential approach. Where it is necessary to alter, local authorities need to look at PDL, previously developed land, first, then Greybelt, then Greenbelt. So it's not a total free-for-all. But suffice it to say, Greybelt is headline news for a reason. It's a really significant policy shift. With that, I'm going to turn to Peter to talk to us about one of the other major elements of the update, transitional arrangements, and a bit on the duty to cooperate.
First part I'm going to look at is that relating to the processes of collaboration, duty to cooperate. Now, as we know, the duty to cooperate is something that the Labour Party was somewhat less than enamoured with, and they wish to deal with it in a rather more structured way in due course, in order that those processes of cooperation will be dealt with rather more strategically. That's probably going to require something rather more than just policy changes. So the result is that for the purposes of the NPPF, what can they do at this stage, which is in the nature of a policy change that's capable of being dealt with relatively quickly. So what they have done within the terms of paragraphs 24 to 28 in particular of the new NPPF is to strengthen the duty to cooperate requirements. So that's trying to make those strategic level cross-boundary arrangements rather more entrenched. And the reason being, it's part of a template with which we are now pretty familiar, is a vital and increasing role in how sustainable growth is delivered. So that introduces in a new form what that duty to cooperate, or the elements that constitute that duty to cooperate, are. So what they want to make sure is that these policies are consistent, that there are relationships, and that where unmet needs are identified between one authority and another neighbouring authority, that they're provided for, and that there is joined up thinking. Now, it possibly is something of a piece with the need for greater consistency and perhaps reduced pragmatism on the part of inspectors when looking at plans, i.e., if those plans have been brought forward in a manner that in reality does require much greater consistency, cooperation and joined up thinking, and they have not been brought forward in that way, then in those circumstances I think it might be reasonable to anticipate that inspectors will be less indulgent of those rather perhaps poorly drafted statements of common ground or memoranda of understanding, which in actual fact perhaps represent more memoranda of misunderstanding, both for then and for the future. And I have a feeling that there may well be less indulgence along that way. Now, like with many things which I may say, I may be proved wrong, but I have a feeling that that is intended to be the tempo of what is coming along, and let's see what happens. I'm now going to move on to look at some of the transitional provisions. For the moment, I'm going to deal with these relatively succinctly and briefly as to what is going on. Part of the wonderful exercise on transitional provisions is that local authorities have been given a little bit more time. It was originally indicated they would be given a month. Now they've been given until the 12th of March 2025. For those of you who are of a horse riding variety, you'll recognise that that falls within the Gold Cup week at Cheltenham, and that means that by the time that they've got to day 2 of the Gold Cup meeting, those authorities that have not been able to surmount the hurdles of producing a suitable draft plan will have a new hurdle to deal with. So that is the date for any new plans to go to examination, 12th of March 2025. And if they are able to achieve that 12th of March 2025 date, then in those circumstances, the examination will proceed on a rather more indulgent, more than 80% of the standard local housing need number. That is going to be, for some of the authorities, I would suggest, quite a high bar for them to achieve. And particularly in light of some of the numbers that they have been required to obtain and what has been happening in terms of their housing delivery target scores, I think that there is going to be some difficulty with that. So one is examination. Secondly, those who get to Regulation 19 consultation stage by that same 12th March date. And again, where that housing requirement number, the magic 80%. Now, that's the objective that they've been given. So for some authorities, that will come as a sigh of relief in respect of those time periods. For others, I think it is just going to be a hopeless task. However, much like those who fall off a boat somewhere near a wall on a river or riverbank, we will probably see the somewhat Mickey Mouse or other versions of Disney character trying to scrabble for that bank in a rather hopeless and vain attempt to try and demonstrate that they actually have the numbers concerned. If they don't have the numbers concerned, then in those circumstances, echoing some earlier observations I made, it seems to me that inspectors are going to be perhaps less enamoured by granting a degree of excessive pragmatism in order to allow authorities to be able to squeak over the line. Because at some stage, if they haven't, by the time that they've got to the 12th of March, found where the numbers are that are going to be sufficient for their purposes, then in those circumstances, I think they're going to have some difficulty later on. There will need to be other transitional dates to be considered, including March 2026, but that's down the tracks for the time being. And I think for the purposes of this exercise, we just need to know what local authorities are going to be doing in the short term. When it gets to March 2026, if they've not got their numbers, we will all know about it by then.
Thank you, Peter. I think my new business idea is going to be to produce a series of flowcharts to accompany the new framework. I think there may be quite a lot of call for them the further we go on. Sean, can we come to you to deal with something that is often a slightly overlooked element of national planning, to do with the economy?
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. So I'm going to be focusing on the economy, and that has been a clear focus of the Labour government since they've been elected, with really sharp focus on growth. And we've seen that played out in the relatively modest revisions to the framework. Firstly, we see clear linkages now between the economy and the National Industrial Strategy, which is called Invest 2035. And we see in the framework that there is a need for planning policies to have regard to this document. Now, I think what's been slightly overlooked in some of the commentary on the changes to the NPPF is how extensive the industries named in the footnotes are. So they are encompassing advanced manufacturing, clean energy, but also the likes of creative industries, defence, digital and technologies, financial services, life sciences, as well as professional and business services. So some express reference to those industries through the footnote referencing Invest 2035, and those industries being given particularly clear support with the revisions. And the one thing that the framework doesn't do is set out, for example, employment floor space targets, nor does it prescribe any kind of method for assessing employment land supply. So business as usual in that regard. The government also set out clear ambitions for support for development clusters. And the first track change that I specifically want to pick up is in respect of paragraph 86C, which is where the government say that they want to pay particular regard to facilitating development to meet the needs of a modern economy, including, and then they list a whole range of particular types of development that they will support. So laboratories, gigafactories, data centres, digital infrastructure, freight and logistics. Obviously a non-exhaustive list, so that doesn't preclude other forms of development coming forward. But I think there is very clear support indeed encapsulated in 86C for those particular types of development. That's sort of then fed through into paragraph 87, where there is a greater emphasis on expanded facilities, particularly those types of development which I've previously mentioned. And we've seen not only through modifications to the policy, but also through recent decision taking just this week, express support on behalf of the Secretary of State for the proposed data centre at Court Lane. We can already see that playing out not only in the revisions to the framework, but also in decision taking. Paragraph 87, we see the removal of the reference to beautiful in relation to the rural economy. And then finally, Daniel's already touched on this point, in relation to commercial development in the green belt. It's very clear from the consultation responses, the government's response to the consultation, that respondents had some reservations about supporting commercial development in the green belt. But we can see that the revised framework expressly supports commercial development in the green belt. It's far from prohibited, and it could even be considered to be appropriate development rather than inappropriate development. That is obviously subject to the important caveats that it would need to utilise grey belt land, it would need to not undermine purposes, and it would need to be in a sustainable location and meet the golden rules, as Daniel has already covered. There is, I think, a little bit of clunky drafting on this particular provision, given that the golden rules are largely irrelevant to commercial development in the green belt. For example, the paragraphs which refer to affordable housing are unlikely to be very relevant, I would suggest, to a commercial development in the green belt. And neither is the provision which refers to green spaces accessible to the public. I don't really think those necessarily were foreseen to apply to commercial development. So really, of the golden rules in order to be considered appropriate development in the green belt, it seems to me that necessary improvements to local or national infrastructure is probably the most, if the only, relevant golden rule which should be applied. And of course, it's still open to promoters of such schemes to rely upon the very special circumstances test if it is considered that the commercial development is inappropriate development in the green belt in any event.
Thanks, John. It's some slightly squirreled away elements of the new framework there, but no less important for that. Some steps forward, but some further work to do, perhaps. On which topic, Christian, can I come to you to talk a little bit about a topic that's occupied the High Court and the Court of Appeal quite a lot in the last 18 months or so, the ever-tricky issue of flood risk and sequential testing?
You certainly can, thank you. A topic which I'm rather interested in. It's a topic of geekery to some degree, but one that has, to date, had real practical consequences. So where were we till yesterday? I've got my site. If it's in zone 1 and above a certain size threshold, I need to do a site-specific flood risk assessment. If any part of it, is in zones 2 or 3, then not only do I have to do a site-specific flood risk assessment, but I also, unfortunately, then end up within some of the previous provisions of the framework, which broadly fall under the description of sequential test. So lots of scenarios, particularly in relation to the court cases you've referred to there, Daniel, Mead Realisations and Redrow and others, that a real tricky problem as to, is a sequential test required or not? And ultimately, we've been getting to a position whereby the answer almost invariably is yes, which opens up a whole can of worms about what is the scope of that assessment. Is the person with whom I need to agree the scope, i.e. the local planning authority, going to be reasonable in the approach? It ended up, I had got to a point where it wasn't too dissimilar to the retail sequential assessment approach, which really, if you got yourself a very large scheme, then it became much easier to pass the sequential test, because obviously there were much fewer sites which might be available to accommodate your development, even if you've shown flexibility, even if you've considered sites which might be able to deliver the overall development, but separately. The real problem arose with all of those schemes which are delivering housing and other forms of development all over the country, which are modestly sized. So, I've got my scheme, for example, for 40 houses in a district. It's otherwise in an agreeable location, it's sustainable, no particular technical constraints, no particular harms identifiable, but part of it might be in flood risk zone 2, or indeed even in flood risk zone 3, but I might not be building on that. Or my proposal, my site flood risk assessment, might have shown that post-development there won't be a flood risk, or indeed there might even be betterment in terms of the way that my development is going to deal with the existing flood risk and how that then impacts the surrounding area. But none of that mattered, because I still had to do a sequential test. And in most scenarios, for relatively modestly sized sites, there probably are some reasonably alternative sites which might be able to accommodate the development. And this has proved a real problem in ensuring that a sufficient supply of housing, for example, is coming forward, because there's been lots of sites which otherwise would have been broadly acceptable. Obviously, some elements of that are subjective, but were otherwise prevented by the fact that the sequential test simply posed too great an obstacle. Because if one is looking, for example, in the entire district, because you're meeting a generalised housing need as opposed to a hyper-specific local one, then there's a lot of sites that you need to consider. And even if you go through that process, it's an incredible amount of work to prepare a flood risk sequential assessment. And there are a great many, not uncertainties, but a great many considerations or factors which fall entirely down to judgment. How do I compare the different types of flood risk as against different types of flood risk on another site? Or the fact that 10% of my site might be subject to the potential for surface water flooding, but 13% of a different site is potentially at risk of river flooding, for example. How do you even compare the two? But the answer has arrived, and the answer is in the revised framework, and that is at paragraph 175. Because what that now tells us is that the sequential test should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding, as per the previous position, except in situations where a site-specific flood risk assessment demonstrates that no built development within the site boundary, including access or escape routes, land raising or other potentially vulnerable elements, would be located on an area that would be at risk of flooding from any source now and in the future. So what you can now do is you can actually look to the scheme you are going to develop. I can now take into account my, whatever it is, my sustainable urban drainage system, my attenuation ponds, whatever it is I'm doing to actually, just make this site practically developable, I can take into account at the stage of the consideration of flood risk. And just as importantly, the mere fact that some of my site, which I might be leaving to wildflowers or trees or grassland, if that is in the flood zone that we're concerned with, previously that would have triggered the requirement for the sequential test, whereas now it doesn't. It's a real practical approach. It's a real practical change. It's a very sensible change, because what it's actually doing is asking the question, what actually is it that you are proposing to do? And once you have done that, is there going to be a flood risk in terms of either increased flood risk off-site or a flood risk to the future occupants of your development? And provided that you can demonstrate that that is the case, then you avoid the horrors of the sequential test and you tick the box and you move on to all those other exciting considerations that fall to be considered as part of your planning application.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, anytime we get a new framework, it's important to study it closely for the phrases that are going to occupy the court's time. My tip is now and in the future is a phrase that's going to end up in the High Court at some point, trying to work out what can be taken into account in terms of mitigation and measures such as that. Sioned, finally, can I come to you? We've heard about a lot of good news for developers, but it's not a totally rosy picture, I think it's fair to say, when it comes to some other topics, particularly climate change and renewables.
Yes, indeed, that's right, Daniel. So looking at the chapter on renewables and climate change, the first thing to note is that the target to support the transition to net zero by 2050 is recognised. The requirements to look at the impacts of climate change to both mitigation and adaptation, including water scarcity, we've heard a lot about that in recent months, and flood risks and coastal change. So really clear direction there on what the government think climate change should require us to consider. Second, we have the new paragraph 163, which basically states that there is a need to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But in doing so, we should be considering preparing and assessing planning applications, taking into account the full range of potential climate change impacts. Now, importantly, though this sits within the renewables and climate change section, broad area of the framework, that in my mind isn't only a requirement which is relevant to renewable energy projects. That is a requirement which could be said to be applied much more broadly than that. It wasn't foreshadowed in the consultation version, and this will have come as a bit of a surprise to many. I think what's also important to say is that climate change impacts are obviously already considered as part of environmental impact assessments. There's normally a requirement to consider climate change impacts in an environmental statement where they have been scoped in. But there is no indication in the revisions to the framework about the scoping of that task. So whilst there might now be a requirement to consider those impacts, there's no kind of refining of how one might need to address climate change impacts as part of a planning application. And as I've already said, that is framed very broadly in the overall definition section, referring to both mitigation and adaptation. So a real potential for a can of worms to be opened on this particular issue, in my view. And I would imagine that there needs to be some PPG guidance produced relatively quickly to provide some clarity on what is expected. Thirdly, then, there have also been some important moves away from what was trailed in the consultation version in relation to the support for renewable energy development. So those who follow renewable energy development closely will recall that there was, in effect, a presumption proposed as part of the consultation draft version. That hasn't made its way into the final version of the framework. There is the requirement to give significant weight to the proposal's contribution to renewable energy generation, but that more forceful presumption hasn't made the cut. That's come as a disappointment to many who are promoting renewables schemes. And there has obviously been some consideration given to what significant weight means in the recent Bewley-Holmes decision in the High Court. Does significant weight mean significant weight in every case? Arguably not. So I think this section of the framework has largely been seen to be a rowing back based on what was in the consultation response, or at least a dilution of what was expected to come forward. It is worth mentioning, though, that the Clean Power Plan has also been published this week, and that contains a number of important concrete outcomes for the renewable sector. First of those is the reference in that document to the relevance of the PPG. It said that's going to be updated. There is a few lines in that document about the fact that national policy statements are going to be reviewed every 12 months, and a desire for communities to benefit from clean energy infrastructure. Not exactly clear about how that's going to happen, but there really are some potentially quite significant changes to plot policy for the renewable sector as a result of both the NPPF and also the other pieces of documentation which have been released this week.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, definitely. It's an interesting exercise to do, to go back and compare what was in the consultation draft and what's ended up in the final document. It shows, if nothing else, that at least the consultation responses have been taken into account to some extent, but it's a really interesting exercise to go back and compare the two. Can we finish then, finally, Sioned? I'm going to come back to you. We've touched on the topic in the context of the golden rules, but very clearly a topic that's been a huge element of the Deputy Prime Minister's agenda. We've known about that for many months now, and that's affordable housing.
Yeah, there's only three short points, really, Daniel, to say about affordable housing. The first is that the requirement to deliver a minimum of 25% of affordable housing as first homes no longer applies. Secondly, we see affordable housing baked into the presumption in paragraph 11D2. I think that's quite significant. And thirdly, we see a number of references to social rent, and indeed the definition of social rent has been changed. So perhaps no surprises there, given how important Angela Rayner considers social rented housing delivery and how important that has been to the government's overall agenda.
Thanks, Sion. It's very clear that affordable housing is still absolutely top priority for the government and for the Deputy Prime Minister in particular. It's worth noting as well, while we're on that topic, one of the other major amendments that we've seen is the removal altogether of Annex 4, the controversial, shall we say, annex dealing with viability, including in the Greenbelt on affordable housing. That's gone. Much to ponder there as well. There we are. Those are the key headlines. There's clearly going to be plenty more to discuss about the effects of the new framework on plan making and decision making in the new year, hopefully with the benefit of some updated guidance and maybe even with the benefit of some early decisions. So watch this space.